Ilara Voss stood in the gold-leafed foyer of the Gilded Flame, the most expensive Italian restaurant in Chicago, looking as if someone had just hauled her out of the Chicago River. Water dripped steadily from her brown hair, plastered flat and heavy. The black dress she'd borrowed from Sienna was now darker, sodden and clinging with its weight. Toward her. The hostess froze midway toward her. The hostess froze midway through a smile, her expression shifting from welcome to alarm. "I have a reservation," Ilara said softly, her voice trembling with cold. "A table for two under the name Kyle." The hostess blinked twice, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. "I'm sorry. Perhaps you'd like to reschedule." Before Ilara could answer, the velvet curtain to the VIP section parted. A tall man stepped out in a perfectly tailored black three-piece suit. Ronan Kale, dark hair combed back, a few strands of silver at his temples, eyes a gray-blue as cold as steel. A faint scar along the left side of his jaw twitched when he saw her. He stopped short. Silence stretched between them like a chasm. Ilara watched his gaze move from her bare foot, leaving a small puddle on the marble, to the soaked dress clinging to her body, then to the blood on her cheek. Back. But he didn't move toward her back. But he didn't move toward her either. "Mr. Kyle," the hostess cut in quickly, relief edging her voice. "Perhaps this is a misunderstanding. I can call security if you'd like." "No," Ilara interrupted, lifting her chin even as her body shook with cold and exhaustion. "I know what I look like. I know you want to walk away, but please give me 2 minutes to explain." Ronan Kyle, the man rumored to be the most dangerous in Chicago, stood there, his gray-blue eyes sweeping over her as if he were weighing her on invisible scales. His jaw tightened, and Ilara could see he was deciding. Then his eyes met hers, and something held him still. Maybe it was the exhaustion in the way she stood. Maybe it was the dried blood on her cheek that wasn't hers. Or maybe it was the simple fact that even looking as if she'd just escaped death, she had still come. 2 minutes, he said at last, his voice low and emotionless. He gestured toward a shadowed corner beside the fireplace, away from the diners who were watching so intently. Ilara nodded, fighting back tears. She followed him, leaving a long trail of water across the deep red velvet carpet. She wanted to disappear on the spot. Ronan folded his arms and kept his distance 2 paces back, standing like a stone monument. "My sister told me you were worth meeting," he said flatly. "Sienna says you're the kindest person she knows. So enlighten me. What brings the kindest person she knows in here looking like she just crawled out of a wreck?" There was no disgust in his tone, only the coolness of a man accustomed to seeing everything. Ilara drew a deep breath and forced herself to meet those gray-blue eyes. She would not apologize for what she'd done. She would not be ashamed of choosing to act. "I was on my way here," she began, her voice growing steadier even as her lips still trembled from the cold. "I actually left early. Sienna lent me the dress. My hair was done. For the first time in years, I thought I looked all right." Ronan didn't react, but he didn't interrupt. "Then I heard the screech of brakes." Ilara paused, her hand tightening around the one heel she still had. On Riverside Bridge, a car lost control on the wet road. It hit the guardrail and it went into the river. Ronan's gray-blue eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent. "People were screaming. Someone called 911, but the car was sinking. And I saw—" Her voice caught. A small hand pounding on the back window, a child's hand. Ronan's posture changed, his shoulders angling forward, his crossed arms slowly dropping. The boy was about 6 years old. 6, trapped in a sinking car with his mother unconscious, and the water was pouring in. Ilara looked straight at him, so I jumped. She said it simply as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I didn't think about the dress or the hair or this dinner or anything else. I just I couldn't stand there and watch a child drown. I couldn't. How would Ronan Cale react? Would the coldest mafia boss in Chicago believe the story of this drenched woman? And what would happen when two people from completely different worlds began to truly see each other? If you want to know what happens next, please hit like to support the channel. Don't forget to share this story with friends who love moving emotional stories and subscribe so you won't miss the next part. Ronan stood there, his gray-blue eyes never leaving her face. The first layer of coldness had dissolved, replaced by something Alara didn't dare to name. He didn't cut her off, didn't show impatience. He simply stood and listened, as if every word she spoke mattered more than anything else in the world. Alara swallowed and went on, her voice dropping as the memory rushed back. The water was so cold she thought her heart would stop the instant it met the river. But she didn't stop. She swam toward the sinking car and saw the boy's small hand still striking the rear window, weaker now than before. The door was jammed by the pressure of the water, impossible to open from the outside. Alara looked around in desperation, searching for a way. Then she remembered her high heels. She pulled off the other shoe still on her foot, gripped the sharp heel in her fist, and slammed it into the back window with all the strength she had. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th blow, the glass gave way. Shards sliced into her hand. Blood unfurled into the river water, mixing with the cold. Alara didn't feel the pain. All she saw were the boy's eyes full of terror and yet full of hope when he saw her. His name was Theo, 6 years old. She knew his name because his mother, the woman unconscious in the driver's seat, had screamed her son's name before the car went under. Alara pulled Theo through the broken frame, careful to keep him from the jagged edges. The boy clung to her neck as if his life depended on it, because it did. She brought him up to the surface, told him to hold on to a floating marker post nearby, promised she'd come back. Then she dove again. The boy's mother, Lydia, was still unconscious. The seatbelt was jammed, the latch refusing to release. Alara tried to free it and couldn't. Her lungs began to burn with the need for air, but she wouldn't give up. She found a larger piece of glass from the shattered window and used it to cut through the belt. The shard bit deep into her palm. Blood poured out, but at last the strap snapped. She dragged Lydia out of the car just as the vehicle sank all the way to the bottom of the river. Alara stopped then and lifted her hand for Ronan to see. The cuts were still red, some already clotted, some still seeping. The smear of blood on her cheek came from the moment she'd wiped her face without thinking. Her hands slick with blood when she was trying to breathe after getting Lydia to the bank. The rescue team arrived right after that. They loaded Lydia and Theo into an ambulance. The medics wanted to examine Alara, but she refused. She simply stood there shaking in a drenched dress, watching the ambulance carry the mother and child away. Theo turned back to look at her through the glass and lifted his small hand in a wave. She waved back. Then she looked at her watch. 13 minutes until the reservation. Alara lived far from this restaurant. If she went home to change, she'd be late by at least an hour and a half, and Ronan would sit here alone, waiting, and then realize she wasn't coming. Alara met Ronan's eyes as she said what came next. She knew what it felt like to be abandoned. She knew what it meant to sit and wait for someone only to understand they were never going to come. Her father had promised he'd be home after his last shift. He never came home. She didn't want Ronan to feel that. She didn't want him to think he didn't matter, that she couldn't be bothered to show up, that she didn't respect his time. So she came. No matter how she looked, even knowing he might turn his back and walk away, at least he would know she'd tried. At least he would know he was worth her showing up. Silence closed over them after Alara finished. She stood there drenched, trembling, waiting for judgment. She'd said everything that needed to be said. Now the decision belonged to him. Ronan Cale looked at her for a long time. Those gray-blue eyes took in every detail. The dried blood on her cheek, the wet hair stuck to her skin, the lips gone pale from cold. And yet he saw something else, too: resilience, honesty, a fierce regard for other people, even at the cost of herself. And in that moment, something shifted in his gaze. The coldness vanished completely. In its place was something warmer, softer, as if for the first time in a very long time, he was seeing a real human being standing in front of him. Not someone after his money, his power, or his name. Just a woman willing to sacrifice everything to save a stranger, and then willing to endure humiliation so another stranger wouldn't have to feel abandoned. Ronan didn't say anything. He only stood there for another moment, those gray-blue eyes still locked on hers. Then he did something Alara never expected. He shrugged out of his black suit jacket, a jacket that was probably worth more than a month of her rent, and gently settled it over her shoulders. The warmth of his body still lingered in the fabric, spreading into Alara's ice-cold skin. She looked up at him, stunned, not knowing how to react. What was he doing? Wasn't he going to walk away? Ronan pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed without even looking at the screen, as if it were a number he called every day. His voice was low and clipped when he spoke into the phone, telling Garrick to bring the car around to the back entrance of the Gilded Flame immediately. He ended the call, looked at her, and said he had an apartment nearby. She needed a hot shower before she came down with pneumonia. After that, they'd have dinner. Maybe not here, but somewhere more comfortable. Alara blinked, not sure she'd heard him correctly. He still wanted to go through with the date. After everything she'd just done, after the pathetic state she was in, after the commotion she'd caused in the foyer of the most luxurious restaurant in Chicago, she opened her mouth to say something, but Ronan had already turned, placed a hand at the small of her back, and gently guided her toward the rear door. His hand was warm through the jacket, steady but not forcing, as if he were shielding her from the eyes that were still fixed on her. They passed through the kitchen, where the chefs paused mid-motion to stare with open curiosity, and then out the back, where a sleek black car was already waiting. A tall man with graying hair, sharp angles to his face, and an alert, cutting gaze stood beside it and held the door open. That had to be Garrick. He looked Alara up and down without the faintest change in expression, as if his boss bringing a drenched woman home was an everyday event. Ronan helped Alara into the car, then slid in beside her. The door shut, sealing them off from the outside world. The car moved smoothly through the streets of Chicago. Alara sat curled into Ronan's jacket, still unable to believe what was happening. She'd braced herself to be turned away, to be laughed at, to be stared down with contempt. She hadn't braced herself for this kindness. Ronan's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time, Alara saw the faintest hint of a smile pass across his mouth. He answered, his voice softening noticeably as he said he was fine, and his sister didn't need to worry. Alara guessed it was Sienna, the sister who'd arranged this blind date. Ronan reassured her that everything was good, even better than he'd expected. He'd explain later. Right now, he was busy. He hung up and turned toward Alara. Her face must have been full of questions because he let out a quiet breath and explained. Sienna was his younger sister. She was a resident at Chicago Memorial Hospital. She'd been begging him to go on dates for months, telling him he'd been alone too long, that he needed someone in his life. He'd agreed just to get her to stop pestering him. He hadn't expected anything at all. Ronan paused, looking at Alara with an expression she couldn't decipher. Then he went on and said he hadn't expected to meet someone like her. Alara felt her cheeks heat, even though the rest of her was still chilled to the bone. Anyone else would have called security or worse, turned their back without even listening. Why had he given her a chance? Ronan was quiet for a moment, watching the city lights slide past the window like blurred streaks. Then he looked back at her, and when he spoke, his voice lowered. So sincere it made Alara's heart tighten. He said that in his world, everyone wanted something. Money, power, access. No one did anything without a purpose. No one sacrificed without demanding a return. but she had jumped into a freezing river to save strangers. She had traded her appearance, her health, an evening that could change her life, all of it, for a child she had never even met. And then she had come here soaked, bleeding, exhausted, because she didn't want another stranger to feel abandoned. Ronan tilted his head, studying her as if he were trying to memorize every line of her face. He asked if she had any idea how many people in his life had ever done that, cared more about how he might feel than about how they looked. Ilara shook her head, not knowing the answer. Ronan smiled, but the smile was strangely sad. He said, "No one. Not a single person. Not until today." The car stopped in front of a high-rise building, the lobby lights spilling out in a bright glow. Ronan opened the door and offered his hand. "You showed up, Ilara," he said, his voice gentle but sure. "Dirty, soaked, bleeding. But you showed up. That's what matters. That's all that matters." Ilara placed her hand in his, feeling warmth flow from his fingers into her own. And for the first time since she'd jumped into that bitterly cold river, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she'd done the right thing. Ronan's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the Morrison Tower, looking out over Chicago's night skyline. Ilara stepped inside, her bare feet leaving wet marks on the dark wood floor, and she had to fight the urge to gape at what she saw. The place was vast and modern, with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling glass that let the city's light spill in like a glittering quilt of stars. But what surprised Ilara wasn't the luxury. It was the personal touches scattered everywhere. Books stacked on the coffee table, an old piano in the corner, family photographs lined along a shelf. This didn't feel like the home of a cold-blooded kingpin. It felt like the home of a lonely man trying to create a little warmth inside four walls. Ronan guided her through the living room, pointed down the hall, and told her the bathroom was at the end on the left. Clean clothes were in the closet. Sienna's things. His sister kept them here whenever she came by. Ilara could use whatever she needed and make herself comfortable. He'd order food while he waited. Ilara nodded and walked on legs that still trembled. The bathroom was bigger than the bedroom in her rented apartment, with a marble tub and a shower with multiple jets. She looked at herself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize what stared back. Hair plastered down, face smeared with dried blood, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. She looked like she'd stepped out of a disaster film. She turned on the hot water and let it wash away the mud and the crusted blood. Heat soaked into her bones, driving out the cold that had clung to her for hours. She stood beneath the spray for a long time, letting the water run over her face, mingling with tears she hadn't even realized had started. Everything that had happened tonight crashed over her all at once. The scream of brakes, the car plunging into the river, Theo's small hand pounding against the glass, the knife-edged cold of the water, the boy's terrified eyes, and then Ronan Cale's eyes. The eyes of a man who should have walked away and yet chose to stay. While Ilara showered, Ronan stood at the living room window with his phone pressed to his ear. He called Garrick, his voice low and quick. He wanted Garrick to look into the car accident on Riverside Bridge tonight. Find out about the rescue, the names, their condition, everything. Garrick didn't ask why. He only said he'd have answers soon and ended the call. Ronan stared out at the city, his mind turning. He didn't know why he was doing any of this, bringing a stranger home, letting her borrow his sister's clothes, ordering pizza as if this were an ordinary night. Maybe because it had been too long since he'd met anyone who could surprise him. In his world, everything was predictable. Everyone was predictable, but Ilara Voss wasn't. She was entirely, unsettlingly unpredictable. Ilara came out later, her hair still damp, her face clean, wearing Sienna's jeans and a cream-colored sweater. No makeup, no high heels, no beautiful dress. Just her, simple and honest. And Ronan realized she was beautiful. Not the dazzling kind of beauty you saw on models or movie stars, the beauty of truth, of green eyes lighting up when she saw the pizza box on the table and gave a small smile. They sat on the sofa with the pizza between them, each holding a glass of orange juice. No expensive wine, no romantic candles, just pepperoni pizza and an unexpected ease between two strangers. They began to talk. Small stories at first. Alara told him she'd grown up in the suburbs of Chicago and had a younger sister named Mira. Ronan told her he had a younger sister, Sienna, the one who'd forced him into tonight's date. They laughed at the coincidence, both of them with stubborn younger sisters who loved interfering in their older siblings' love lives. Ronan's phone vibrated. A text from Garrick. He read quickly, then looked up at Alara with an expression she couldn't read. He said he'd had someone check her story. The accident on Riverside Bridge. The woman who jumped into the river to save a mother and child. Alara set her slice of pizza down, her heart beating faster. She didn't blame him. In his position, she would have checked too. Still, a small hurt pricked at her when she realized he hadn't fully believed her. Ronan watched her, then went on and said it was all true. Lydia Morrison and her son Theo both were being treated at the hospital, their condition stable. Witnesses described the rescuer as a brown-haired woman in a black dress who had gone into the river without hesitation. He paused, looking at her with an intensity Alara couldn't interpret. He said he was sorry he doubted her. Alara shook her head and told him she understood. In his world, she imagined people couldn't trust easily. Ronan didn't deny it. Instead, he reached toward her and gently took her wrist. Alara startled and nearly pulled away, but he had already seen it, the scar. Not from tonight, an older scar, faint but clear, running along the inside of her right wrist. A burn, not a cut, still a scar. Ronan looked up, gray-blue eyes meeting her green ones. He asked softly what had happened. Alara looked down at the scar, then back at the man waiting for her answer. She could lie. She could say it was a cooking accident or a burn from childhood. But looking into those eyes, the eyes that had given her a chance when no one else would, she didn't want to lie. For years, always in long sleeves, always for years, always in long sleeves, always sidestepping the questions. But tonight, sitting here with the man who'd given her a chance when no one else had, she could feel the walls she'd built starting to crumble. She began at the beginning. Her father, Harlan Voss, had been a firefighter. Years of service, never once seriously injured. He'd been her hero, the man who taught her that life only has meaning when you help other people. There was a massive fire in an apartment building on the south side. Her father had finished his shift and was on his way home, but he heard the report on the radio, knew the crew was short, and he turned back. He saved many people before the ceiling collapsed. They found him with a child in his arms, using his own body to shield the little girl. The girl lived. Her father didn't. Alara's voice trembled as she went on. After her father died, she decided to become a nurse. She wanted to save people the way he had. She wanted to be worthy of his sacrifice. She worked in the emergency department at Chicago Memorial Hospital, where Sienna was doing her residency. That was how she met Sienna and how they became friends. On a night shift, she admitted a patient she'd never forget. Nadia, a victim of domestic violence. Her husband had poured boiling oil over her, burns over much of her body. Alara stayed beside Nadia all night, held her hand, talked to her, promised her everything would be all right. But it wasn't all right. Nadia died in Alara's hands. Alara lowered her gaze, her voice dropping so far, Ronan had to lean in to catch it. But that wasn't what made her quit. Nadia's husband came to the hospital right after, drunk, shouting, demanding to see his wife. When security tried to stop him, he pulled a knife. Alara put herself between him and the patient area where other people were still being treated. He slashed at her. She threw up her arm to block, and the blade tore across her wrist. But worse than that, he had a lighter. He meant to burn the entire emergency department down. In the struggle, the flame caught her hand. Security restrained him in time, but the burn had already bitten deep into her flesh. Alara stopped, drew a shaky breath, and said that after that night, she couldn't go back to the hospital. Every time she stepped inside, she saw Nadia's face. She saw him with the knife and the lighter. She panicked, couldn't breathe, couldn't work. The doctor diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder. She left her job, lost the work she loved, lost the purpose she'd built for herself over so many years. Bitterly, she said she was weak. She gave up. She wasn't worthy of being her father's daughter. Ronan didn't speak while Alara talked. He only sat there and listened, his gray-blue eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he reached out and took her hand gently. He said she stepped in front of a blade for her patients. She was burned trying to stop a madman from setting an entire emergency department on fire. She stayed beside a dying woman all night, even knowing she wouldn't make it. And she called that weakness. Alara looked up, startled by the force in his voice. He held her gaze and said, "She wasn't weak, Alara. She was wounded." There was a world of difference between those two things. Her eyes stung. It was the first time in years anyone hadn't blamed her. No one told her she should have been stronger, tried harder, gotten over it. He simply acknowledged that her pain was real and it deserved respect. She asked him again, her voice as light as breath, "Who are you, Ronan Kale?" Ronan was silent for a long time. Then he sighed, let go of her hand, and looked out through the glass at Chicago spread beneath them. He said she'd told him her truth. He owed her his. He said he ran an organization, not entirely legal. His father built it, and when his father died, he took over. They ran underground gambling, loans, protection for neighborhoods the police didn't bother with. Some people called it the mafia. He called it the family business. Alara didn't flinch. Didn't look afraid the way he might have been expecting. She only asked what he didn't do. Ronan looked at her, surprised by the question, then nodded. They didn't deal drugs. They didn't traffic people. They didn't touch innocent women and children. That was his rule, his line that couldn't be crossed. His mother taught him that. She told him that no matter what he did to protect his family, he must never become the kind of man who made others suffer the way she once suffered. Then he went on, his voice turning darker, and said his father had been killed, betrayed by a man his father had once treated like a brother, Victor Russo. Russo wanted control of a drug pipeline his father refused to enter. When his father said no, Russo had him assassinated. Ronan found his father in the office, blood everywhere. He was still holding a family photograph in his hand. Alara saw old pain flash through those gray-blue eyes, and she understood. They were more alike than she'd thought. They'd both lost their fathers. They both carried scars that couldn't be healed. Ronan said that after that day, he learned to shoot. He could hit a target from far away. He swore he'd never let anyone harm his family again. His mother suffered a stroke when she heard what happened to his father. She never fully recovered. He paused, then looked at Alara with something she'd never seen in anyone. Complete honesty, no hiding, no armor. He said Russo was still out there, waiting for the chance to take revenge because Ronan had taken back what had been stolen from his family. Russo was looking for Ronan's weakness, and tonight, for the first time in years, Ronan Kyle had a weakness. He looked at Alara and she understood he was talking about her. That night they talked until it was very late. Not the heavy stories anymore, just small pieces of each other's lives, the kind you only offer when you feel strangely safe. Alara told him about her sister Mira, a stubborn girl pregnant whose baby's father had run off. Ronan told her about Sienna, the one person who could still make him laugh for real. They shared things they'd never said out loud to anyone. And when Alara finally drifted off to sleep on the sofa, Ronan pulled a blanket over her and then sat there watching her for a long time. He didn't understand what was happening inside him. He only knew this woman had come into his life like a storm, and he didn't want her to leave. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the glass and woke Alara. She blinked, taking a few seconds to remember where she was. Ronan's penthouse, a soft sofa, a warm blanket over her, and the rich smell of coffee drifting in from somewhere. She sat up and saw Ronan in the open kitchen, 2 cups of coffee waiting on the counter. He'd changed, wearing a black dress shirt and slacks, polished and composed, And yet there was still something dangerous in the way he stood, the way he moved. He noticed she was awake and gave a faint smile, telling her the coffee was ready and he'd already called for breakfast to be delivered. After that, he'd take her home. They ate in a comfortable silence, exchanging a few short remarks now and then. Ilara realized she liked that quiet. It didn't feel awkward or strained. It was simply two people at ease with each other's presence, without the need to fill every space with words. When they finished, Ronan took her down to the parking garage where Garrick was waiting beside the familiar black car. But before they could get in, Garrick stepped closer to Ronan and murmured something into his ear. Ilara saw Ronan's body go taut, his jaw clench, his gray-blue eyes darken in an instant. Then he nodded, clapped Garrick on the shoulder, and turned back to her with a smile as if nothing had happened. He opened the car door for her and apologized for making her wait. Just a few small work matters. Ilara knew he was hiding something. She'd worked in high-stress environments long enough to recognize the way people tried to mask worry. But she didn't ask. They'd only known each other for one night. She had no right to demand he share everything. As the car rolled through the streets of Chicago, Ronan stared out the window, his mind spinning with what Garrick had just reported. Someone had been watching the Gilded Flame last night. Not his people, not the police, Russo's men. They'd seen Ilara walk into the restaurant. They'd seen him put her in the car. They'd followed them all the way back to the Morrison Tower. Anger rose hot in Ronan's chest. Russo was watching him. The old bastard was hunting for his weakness, looking for a way to take revenge for what Ronan had done after his father's death. And now the old man might have found it. Garrick had added more while Ilara couldn't hear. Russo was older now, but he was still as dangerous as he'd been in his younger days. He didn't do the dirty work himself anymore, but he had his own private army. He had money. He had ruthlessness without limits. He'd waited years for the right moment to bring Ronan down, and Garrick feared that moment might involve the woman sitting in this car. Ronan glanced at Ilara, who was gazing out the window, lost in thought. She didn't know she might already be under surveillance. She didn't know that simply meeting him for one night could make her a target for one of the most dangerous men in Chicago. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to warn her, but he didn't want to frighten her. Didn't want to push her away before he even had the chance to understand what was happening between them. The car stopped in front of an old apartment building on the south side, Ilara's place. Ronan studied the building, memorizing the address, assessing the security. No guard. The main lock looked old and worn. The lower windows would be easy to breach. He didn't like it. Ilara turned to him with a small smile and thanked him for last night, for everything. She didn't know what else to say, but she wanted him to know that the night had meant something to her. Ronan looked at her, and in that moment, he made a decision. He told her he wanted to see her again, not because Sienna had pushed him, not out of obligation, because he wanted to. Ilara felt her heart pick up its pace. She nodded and said she wanted that too. They exchanged phone numbers. Ronan opened the car door for her, watched her walk into the building, and waited until she disappeared behind the entrance before he signaled Garrick to drive. As they pulled away, Ronan took out his phone and called Garrick. Even though Garrick was sitting right in the driver's seat, in a voice cold as steel, he ordered him to increase surveillance on Russo 24 hours a day. He wanted to know every move the man made, and he wanted someone posted on this building discreetly. She wasn't to know. Garrick nodded in the rearview mirror and asked if he thought Russo would make a move. Ronan looked out the window, his gray-blue eyes gone hard and distant. He didn't know, but he wouldn't let that man lay a hand on anyone he cared about. Not this time. Not ever again. Weeks passed like a dream. Ilara didn't know what to call what was happening between her and Ronan. They weren't officially dating. They didn't put a label on anything. And yet, somehow, Ronan Kyle had become part of her everyday life. It started with small things. A bouquet of white daisies appeared at her apartment door after they met. No card, no sender's name. But Alara knew exactly who it was from. She told him that white daisies were her mother's favorite, that her father used to bring them to her mother every week until the day he died. She hadn't expected him to remember a detail that small. Then Ronan began showing up at the coffee shop where she worked part-time. He'd sit in the corner, order an espresso, and read a book or work on his laptop through her entire shift. When she asked why, he only shrugged and said the coffee was good here. Alara knew he was lying. The coffee at that shop was only decent, but she didn't call him on it, she just smiled. And now and then, she'd bring him a free croissant. After their first date, Ronan took her to the hospital to visit Theo and Lydia. The boy was doing much better, racing around the room, but he was still haunted by water. Lydia, his mother, wrapped Alara in a fierce hug the moment she saw her, sobbing and calling her an angel who had saved their lives. Alara held her back, feeling warmth spread through her chest. But what left her stunned was when Lydia said an anonymous benefactor had paid every cent of their medical bills. Not only the treatment, but Theo's rehabilitation as well, and a lawyer to help them sue the insurance company that was trying to deny coverage. Lydia said she didn't know who it was, but she would pray for that person every night. Alara turned to look at Ronan, who was standing by the window, pretending to admire the view. He didn't say a word, didn't claim credit, only gave the smallest shrug when he caught her gaze. On the way home, Alara asked him why. He only said that she'd saved their lives, and the least they should have to worry about was paying hospital bills. It wasn't a big deal, but to Alara, it was a big deal. It was proof that the man people whispered was the most dangerous in Chicago had a warmer heart than most of the people she'd ever known. The next day, Sienna asked Alara to meet her alone at a cafe near the hospital. Ronan's sister looked at her with an expression that held both worry and happiness, as if she were trying to find a way to say something difficult. Finally, Sienna let out a breath and began. She said she loved her brother. She loved Alara as her closest friend, and because of that, she had to be honest. Life beside Ronan wasn't easy. He had enemies. He had a complicated past. He lived in a world most people couldn't even imagine. If Alara kept going deeper into this, she needed to understand what she was stepping into. Alara listened without interrupting. She'd known this was coming. She wasn't naive. She knew who Ronan was. She knew what he did, but she also knew who he was when no one was watching. Sienna went quiet for a moment, then spoke again, her voice softer. She said she also had to tell her this. She'd known her brother for years. She'd never seen him like this. He smiled more. He talked about the future. There was light in his eyes she'd thought had gone out the day their father died. Sienna took Alara's hand, looked her straight in the eye, and said she didn't know what would happen between them. But if Alara chose to stay, she promised she would always support her, because for the first time in a very long time, her brother looked truly happy. That night, Ronan drove Alara home after dinner. When they reached her building, Alara saw the light was still on in her apartment. Mira was home. Her sister was pregnant, living with her in the cramped little place. The baby's father had disappeared the moment he learned Mira was pregnant, leaving a young woman to face everything alone. Alara invited Ronan upstairs, and for the first time he saw her real life. The apartment was tiny, the furniture old but clean. Small efforts everywhere to make the space feel cared for. Mira was lying on the sofa, her belly large, her eyes puffy as if she'd been crying. The girl looked at Ronan with weary suspicion, like a small animal sizing up an intruder in her territory. After Mira went into the bedroom, Alara explained their situation. Her mother had died of cancer, leaving behind a crushing pile of hospital debt. The life insurance money from her father's death was long gone. Mira had no job, no health insurance. Alara was working 3 jobs to support them both, to pay down the debt, to prepare for the baby who would be here soon. Ronan listened, and Alara saw something shift in his eyes. He said he could help. Money wasn't an issue for him. He could pay off the debt, cover Mira's delivery costs, even find them a better apartment. Alara shook her head immediately. She said no. She thanked him. But no, she hadn't come to him for money. She didn't want him to think she was with him for what he could give her. She would handle it herself. She always had. Ronan looked at her with an expression that was part admiration, part frustration. He stepped closer, lifted a strand of hair away from her face, and spoke gently. He knew she wasn't here for money. That was exactly why he wanted to help, because she didn't ask for anything. But if she changed her mind, he was here always. Then he bent down and kissed her forehead, soft and warm like a promise. And Alara realized that no matter how hard she tried to resist, her heart had already started to belong to this man. Weeks after their first date, Garrick showed up at Alara's apartment door on a Saturday morning, and she was startled when she opened it to find the tall man with graying hair and eyes sharp as a blade standing there with a seriousness that felt strangely out of place on a weekend. He told her the boss didn't know he was here, and he wanted to keep it that way. But there was something he needed to say, and he hoped she'd listen. Alara let him in, made coffee, and sat across from Ronan's right hand in her tiny apartment. And with Mira gone to a prenatal appointment, they had space to speak privately. Garrick didn't waste time. He said he'd followed the boss for years, since Ronan had been a teenager who just lost his father, and he'd seen everything, the wars, the losses, the enemies who came and went, and he'd also seen people get close to Ronan and get hurt because of it. Alara felt a chill run straight down her spine, but she didn't interrupt. Garrick went on that he wasn't saying this to frighten her. He was saying it because he'd seen the way the boss looked at her, and he'd never seen Ronan look at anyone like that, not even the women who'd come before. She was different, and because of that, she was also more dangerous in the eyes of anyone who wanted to harm the boss. He paused and held her gaze with absolute gravity, then told her that if she was going to be beside the boss, she needed to know how to protect herself. Not because the boss couldn't protect her, but because sometimes, in the most dangerous moments, she might have to save herself before anyone could get there in time. He wanted to teach her some basic self-defense. Alara was quiet for a long time, her thoughts spinning, and she thought of what Sienna had said. She thought of Russo, the enemy Ronan had mentioned the first night they met, and she thought of her own life, of Mira, of the baby on the way, and then she nodded. The following week, Garrick came every day when Ronan was busy with work, and he trained her in the gym of a building Ronan owned, where no one could see them. The lessons weren't fancy martial arts. They were practical skills, the kind that could keep her alive in a real and ugly situation. First, Garrick taught her how to get free from restraints. He tied her hands with rope, with plastic ties, even with handcuffs, and showed her how to find the weak point, how to rotate her wrists, how to use any sharp object nearby to cut through what held her. She failed the first times, but eventually she could free herself quickly. Next came a chokehold technique, not to attack, but to disable someone when she had to. Garrick showed her how to come in from behind, how to lock her arm around an opponent's neck, how to keep pressure long enough to render them unconscious without killing them. And she practiced on a training dummy until the movement felt as natural as breathing. Finally, he taught her how to strike vulnerable points, the eyes, the throat, the groin, the knee, places where a precise blow could drop an opponent, no matter how big they were. Garrick didn't go easy on her. He attacked for real, forcing her to respond for real, and she went home with more than a few bruises. But she didn't complain because she understood what he was trying to prepare her for. One weekend afternoon after training ended, Ronan arrived to pick her up with a look that was hard to read, and he said he wanted to take her to meet someone important. They drove to an upscale nursing home in the suburbs of Chicago, where the gardens were carefully kept and the air felt strangely peaceful. Ronan led her through bright hallways, nodding to familiar nurses, until they stopped at a room at the very end. Isolde Kale sat in a wheelchair by the window, late afternoon sunlight catching in her white silver hair. She was older, a face that must once have been striking now marked by illness and loss, and the right side of her body could barely move after the stroke. But her eyes, gray-blue like Ronan's, were still bright and keen when she saw them enter. Ronan bent to kiss his mother's forehead, his voice so gentle Ilara almost didn't recognize it, and he introduced her, saying, "Mom, this is Ilara, the person I want you to meet." Isolde studied Ilara from head to toe, her gaze sharp as if weighing every small detail, then motioned for her to come closer. Ilara knelt beside the wheelchair so Isolde could see her face clearly, and Isolde lifted the hand she could still move, touched Ilara's cheek, and smiled. She said in a slow voice, words slightly difficult because of the stroke, that she had good eyes, the eyes of someone who'd seen suffering and still kept her kindness. They stayed with Isolde all afternoon, Ronan reading to his mother while Ilara talked with her about everything, from work to her sister, from dreams to fear, and Isolde listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes squeezing Ilara's hand as quiet encouragement. When they were about to leave, Isolde took Ronan's hand and pulled him down closer, and she whispered, but Ilara still heard it, telling him not to lose this girl, that she'd waited a long time to see him look at someone that way. Ronan didn't answer. He only kissed his mother's hand and rose, but when he turned to Ilara, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Determination, as if he just made a silent promise he intended to keep at any cost. After meeting Isolde, Ronan called Ilara in the afternoon and told her he wanted to cook for her tonight. Not a fancy restaurant, not takeout, just him in the kitchen in his penthouse. Ilara agreed without thinking, and when she stepped into the apartment at the top of the Morrison Tower in the evening, the rich scent of garlic sizzling and tomato sauce simmering on the stove stopped her right in the doorway, so surprised she couldn't find a single word. Ronan Cale, the man all of Chicago whispered was the coldest and most dangerous, was standing in the kitchen wearing a gray apron, a wooden spoon in his hand as he stirred a pot of pasta, looking as if he'd been born to do exactly this. He looked up at the sound of her and gave one of his rare smiles, telling her his mother had taught him to cook this when he was young, and it was the only pasta dish he could make without burning it to a crisp. Ilara laughed and walked over to him, watching him add seasoning to the sauce with the kind of concentration that made it seem like the most important work in the world. They ate dinner by the glass windows overlooking Chicago, the city glittering with lights, and Ronan began to talk about his mother, about the days before her stroke, when she'd still been strong and healthy and used to scold him for coming home too late, when she'd cooked Sunday dinners for the whole family and forced Sienna to practice piano, even though the girl hated it with a passion. His voice sank when he mentioned his father, and Ilara saw those gray-blue eyes darken like a sky-gathering storm. He told her he was the one who found his father that day in the office, blood everywhere, and his father still gripping their family photograph in his hand as if it were the last thing he wanted to see before he died. He'd been young, still a child, but after that day, he was never allowed to be a child again. He had to become the man of the family, had to protect his mother and sister, had to face the enemies his father left behind. And he did all of it without shedding a single tear, because he believed crying was weakness. And weakness meant death. Ilara watched him in silence, and she could see beneath the armor of cold power, a young boy still aching, still alone, still waiting for someone to tell him he was allowed to be sad. She stood, stepped to him, and wrapped her arms around him without a word. Ronan went rigid for a second, as if he'd forgotten what it felt like to be held by someone who wanted nothing from him, and then slowly he lifted his hands, circled her back, and held her too. They stayed that way for a long time in the vast penthouse, with the city lights blinking beyond the glass, and Ilara felt his heart pounding hard beneath his ribs. When they finally pulled apart, Ronan looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him, gentle, vulnerable, and completely real. He lifted a hand, brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, and then he leaned down and kissed her. Their first kiss wasn't fierce or rushed. It was soft and unhurried, as if Ronan were asking permission and Ilara were answering yes. When they parted, Alara smiled and said she had a dream she'd never told anyone, not even Sienna. She wanted to open a shelter for victims of domestic violence, a place Nadia should have had before it was too late, a place where women like her could run and be safe, be healed, begin again. She knew it was a big dream, maybe too big for what she could manage. But she couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop seeing Nadia's eyes on that last night. Ronan listened, and when she finished, he took her hand, met her eyes, and said that when things were stable, when Russo was no longer a threat, they would build that place together. He promised. Alara looked at him, and she knew a promise from Ronan Cale wasn't something he gave lightly. And she also knew her heart, no matter how hard she tried to protect it, belonged completely to this man. Months passed like a beautiful dream Alara didn't dare believe was real. Her life had changed completely since that night in the penthouse. Since that first kiss by the window overlooking the city of Chicago, Ronan came to see her almost every day, sometimes only to drink coffee with her for a short time between a brutal schedule, sometimes to take her to dinner and talk with her until late. Mira had entered the final stage of her pregnancy, her belly stretched round and full, the baby inside kicking constantly as if impatient to arrive. Alara had moved into a new apartment, larger and safer, and Ronan had insisted on paying the rent no matter how much she protested. And in the end, she gave in because Mira needed a better place to prepare for the baby. Everything seemed to be going the right way, and Alara began to allow herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved happiness. But darkness always lurked in the places light couldn't reach. That afternoon, Alara left the coffee shop after her shift and walked home as usual. The familiar street, the familiar faces. Nothing seemed out of place until she turned into the shortcut alley she always used. A black van was parked across the passage, and before Alara could turn and run, two men appeared behind her and blocked her in. They didn't touch her. They didn't say a word. They only stood there like two walls of flesh, sealing every way out. The van door slid open, and a man stepped down. He was older, salt and pepper hair, a gaunt face with eyes as cold as a snake's, and he smiled at Alara with a smile that made her shiver down to the bone. He said he had a small gift he wanted to send to Miss Voss, and he hoped she'd deliver it to the right person. He held out a yellow envelope, then turned and climbed back into the van as if this meeting were nothing more than an ordinary conversation between acquaintances. The van sped away. The two men vanished with it, and Alara stood alone in the alley with her heart pounding as if it might burst straight out of her chest. She opened the envelope with trembling hands, and what she saw made the blood in her veins turn to ice. Photographs. Isolde sitting in her wheelchair by the nursing home window, shot from outside through the glass. The angle showing the photographer had been standing frighteningly close. Mira walking down the street to her prenatal appointment, her pregnant belly prominent, her face utterly unaware that someone was watching. And a sheet of paper with smeared black printed lines that said, Ronan Kyle had hours to hand over all of South Chicago territory and millions in cash, or the women in the photos would pay the price in his place. Signed, Victors. Russo. Alara couldn't remember how she ran home, couldn't remember how many times she called Ronan before he finally answered, only that when she finished telling him everything, the line went silent for so long, she thought the call had dropped. Then Ronan's voice came through, colder and more terrifying than anything she'd ever heard, telling her to stay inside. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. He was coming now. Soon after, Ronan arrived with Garrick and other men Alara had never met. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she could feel his body shaking with rage. He looked at the photographs, and Alara saw those gray-blue eyes darken like a sky before a storm. His jaw clenched so hard she could hear his teeth grinding. Garrick stepped to Ronan and said quietly that there was more. Sienna was being watched too. His men had been seen near the hospital where she worked, and they hadn't known until this morning. Ronan closed his eyes, and Alara could see him trying to cage the fury that was about to explode. He ordered Garrick to go to the hospital immediately, pick Sienna up, and take her somewhere safe, not leaving her side for a single second until this was over. Garrick nodded and disappeared out the door, and Ronan turned back to Alara with a look full of pain and guilt. He said he was sorry. He'd pulled her into his world, and now the people she loved were being threatened because of him. Alara took his hand and told him she didn't regret it. She'd known who he was from the beginning, and she'd still chosen to be with him. But now they needed a plan because the time wasn't much, and Russo wasn't the kind of man who bluffed. That night, after Garrick brought Sienna back to the penthouse safely and Mira was moved to a hidden house known only to Ronan and the few closest to him, Ronan called an emergency meeting in his office. But before the meeting began, Alara witnessed something she had never seen in this man. Ronan stood alone in the room, staring at the photographs of Isolde and Mira on his desk. And then the rage erupted like a volcano. He let out a roar thick with fury and swept his arm across the desktop, flinging everything to the floor, papers exploding into the air, a glass of water shattering, a laptop slamming into the wall with a brutal crack. He punched the nearest wall once, twice, 3 times until blood began to seep from scraped knuckles, and still he didn't stop. He shouted that the bastard had dared to touch his mother, touch his sister, touch the woman he loved, and he would kill him. He would tear him apart piece by piece. He would make him pay 1,000 times over for what he'd done to his father years ago. Garrick stood outside the door and didn't dare step in, because he knew that when Ronan lost control like this, no one could stop him. But Alara was different. She pushed the door open, stepped over the broken pieces on the floor, stepped straight into the fury swallowing the room, and walked right up to Ronan. He turned on her with bloodshot eyes, breath coming hard and fast, his whole body shaking with anger, and she understood that in this moment he wasn't the powerful, ice-cold Ronan Kyle. He was simply a man terrified of losing the people he loved. Alara took his bleeding hand in hers, squeezed tight, and said only 2 words in a voice that was strangely calm. "Look at me." Ronan looked at her, and she looked back without fear, without retreat, holding only steady resolve and a love she no longer wanted to hide. She told him that this rage wouldn't help Isolde or Sienna or Mira or anyone at all. It would only steal the clear mind he needed to defeat Russo. She told him she knew he was afraid. She was afraid too, but they couldn't let fear drive them. Slowly, very slowly, she saw the storm in his eyes begin to ease. His breathing slowed, his shoulders dropped, and he let his head fall against her shoulder like a child exhausted after crying. They stayed that way for a long time until Garrick knocked and said it was time to meet and make a plan. In the conference room, Ronan sat at the head of the table with the hand Alara had bandaged. Garrick sat to his right, and Alara sat to his left. They broke down the situation. Russo had more men, the advantage of surprise, and he held the trump card, the safety of the people Ronan loved. That was when Alara spoke and said she had had enough of Ronan's games. And if he attacked head-on, Russo would move on Isolde and Mira before Ronan could get there. That was when Alara spoke and said she had an idea. But she knew Ronan wouldn't like it. She proposed they pretend to surrender, pretend to accept Russo's terms, to buy time and make him careless. She would be the one to meet Russo, carrying the message that Ronan agreed to hand over everything. And while he was busy celebrating, Ronan would have time to prepare a surprise strike from a direction Russo wouldn't expect. Ronan shot to his feet at once and said, "No, absolutely not." He would never let her put herself in danger like that. Alara stood too, met his eyes, and told him she wasn't as fragile as he thought. Garrick had taught her how to defend herself. She knew how to get free from restraints, how to apply a chokehold, how to strike the weak points on a body. She wasn't a princess waiting to be rescued. She was the woman who had jumped into a freezing river to save a child she didn't even know. And she wasn't going to sit still while the people she loved were threatened and do nothing. Ronan shook his head, his voice catching as he said he couldn't lose her. He couldn't survive it if something happened to her. Alara stepped closer, placed her hand over his chest where his heart was pounding, and told him she loved him. She said she'd tried not to, tried to keep her distance, tried to protect her heart, but she'd failed. She'd loved him since the first night he draped his suit jacket over her shoulders in that restaurant. And because she loved him, she couldn't stand by and watch him lose everything just to protect her. Ronan stared at her, and in those gray-blue eyes, Alara saw an ocean of emotion rolling and breaking. Pain, fear, love, and raw desperation. He pulled her into him and kissed her, a kiss nothing like their first gentle one in the penthouse. This one was desperate and hungry, as if he were trying to memorize the feel of her mouth against his, in case it was the last time. When they finally parted, Ronan closed his eyes, drew in a long breath, and at last, he nodded. He said he agreed, but on one condition: Garrick would watch her every second, and if there was even a hint of danger, they would abort the plan immediately. Alara nodded, and she knew they were stepping into the most dangerous gamble of their lives. The plan went into motion the next day before Russo's deadline. Alara went to the meeting point alone, carrying a briefcase filled with forged documents about transferring territory and a message from Ronan saying he accepted every condition. She knew Garrick was watching from a distance. She knew Ronan was waiting for a signal. But when the familiar black van appeared and Russo's men pulled a cloth bag over her head and shoved her into the vehicle, fear still crushed the air out of her chest. They drove for a long time, looping through street after street to shake anyone who might be following. And when the bag was finally yanked away, Alara found herself standing inside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, where light slipped in only through broken high windows, and the stench of damp rot filled her nose. Victor Russo sat on a wooden chair in the middle of the warehouse, legs crossed, his snake-cold eyes watching her with the pleased amusement of a cat playing with a mouse before it eats. He clapped slowly as she was marched in front of him, and he said that Miss Voss was either very brave or very stupid, and he hadn't decided which yet. Alara forced her voice to stay steady as she said she was only a messenger. Ronan had agreed to every condition, and she'd brought documents to prove it. Russo laughed, a dry sound with no joy in it, and he stood and moved closer. He said he'd lived in this world for decades. He'd seen every filthy trick a human being could imagine, and he knew a trap when he saw one. He knew Ronan would never surrender. The son of Kyle would rather die than bow, and sending his lover here was only a way to buy time, while he prepared a counterattack. Alara felt the blood rush up behind her eyes, but she fought to keep the panic off her face. Russo went on, his voice turning colder as he said he knew more than that. He had his own man inside Ronan's organization, an informant who told him every plan before it could be carried out. He knew Garrick was out there somewhere watching. He knew Ronan was waiting for a signal to strike, and he was ready for all of it. Alara's heart seemed to stop when she understood the depth of it. Ronan was walking into a trap he didn't even know was there. Russo ordered his men to tie Alara to an iron post in the corner of the warehouse, and he said he'd keep her there as a welcoming gift when Ronan arrived, because he wanted to see Ronan's face when he realized everything had collapsed. They bound her hands behind her back with coarse rope and left her there with a guard standing a few yards away. While Russo and the others withdrew into the next room to prepare the ambush, Alara closed her eyes and tried to control her wild breathing, and she remembered what Garrick had taught her. The hours in that gym. His steady voice saying that in the most dangerous moments, calm was the most important weapon. She began to rotate her wrists, searching for the weakness in the knot, and at the same time she studied the ground around her. On the warehouse floor, about a yard from where she stood, There was a shard of broken glass from one of the high windows, large enough and sharp enough to cut through rope. She inched toward it little by little, careful not to make a sound while the guard stared out a window with bored indifference. It took time before she could touch the glass with her fingertips, and more before she could wedge it into her palm and start sawing at the rope. The glass sliced her skin. Blood ran and soaked her wrist, but she clenched her teeth and kept going. When the last strand finally snapped, she rose as quietly as she could and moved behind the guard. He didn't have time to react before her arms slid around his throat and tightened exactly the way Garrick had taught, strong enough to cut off blood to the brain, not strong enough to kill. The guard struggled for a few seconds, then went limp, and Alara dug through his pockets for his phone. With shaking hands, she called and spoke fast, telling him Russo knew everything. There was an informant. "Don't come here on the original plan. It's a trap." She got only that far before the door to the side room flew open and Russo appeared with 4 men. He looked at the unconscious guard on the floor, looked at the phone in her hand, and nodded with something like admiration. He said she really was a feral cat with claws, and no wonder Ronan was so taken with her. Then he ordered his men to teach her a lesson. They beat her, fists slamming into her face, her stomach, her ribs over and over, until she collapsed to the floor and couldn't force herself back up. But Alara didn't beg. She didn't cry. She only stared straight into Russo's eyes with open defiance and said Ronan would come. And when he did, Russo would pay for everything he'd done. Russo watched her for a long moment. Then he laughed and said he was looking forward to it. Alara's call lasted less than a minute, but it changed everything. Ronan stood in the safe room where he'd been preparing to lead his men out under the original plan. And the moment he heard Alara's trembling voice say there was an informant, it felt as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over his head. He looked around at the men in the room, the men he'd trusted for years, and he knew one of them had betrayed him. Garrick was the first to move. He drew his gun and aimed it straight at a man near the door, a guy named Marcus, who'd been working for the Kale family for years. Ronan looked at Marcus and caught the flicker of panic in his eyes before the man tried to hide it. And Ronan knew Garrick was right. He didn't ask why, didn't interrogate, didn't waste time. He only nodded at Garrick and said 2 words, "Handle him." The gunshot cracked and Marcus went down, and Ronan had already turned away and started walking before the body hit the floor. He called Sienna and told her everything had changed. She needed to stay with Mira and Isolde, protect them at all costs. He was bringing Alara home. Sienna wanted to ask more, but she knew this wasn't the moment. She only told him to be careful and to bring them both home safe. Ronan rewrote the entire operation within minutes. Instead of hitting the front gate the way Russo was expecting, he split his men into 3 smaller groups and approached the warehouse from 3 different directions, through the roof, through the sewer system behind it, and through a rotted-out wall on the east side. They moved in silence like ghosts in the dark, and when the assault began, Russo's men were caught completely off guard. Gunfire tore through the warehouse, screaming, glass breaking, bodies crashing onto cold concrete. Ronan led the rooftop team. He dropped from a beam with his gun in his hand and took down 2 of Russo's men before his feet even hit the ground. He moved like a killing machine, built for one purpose, precise, ruthless, without hesitation, and every round he fired found its mark. The years of training that began when he was young, the sleepless nights at the range after his father died, all of it had prepared him for this. The fight lasted less than minutes, but to Ronan, it felt like a lifetime. Because with every second that passed, he was thinking of Alara, of what she might be enduring, of the possibility of losing her forever. When the smoke thinned and the last of Russo's men were down or surrendering, Ronan ran for the back room where he'd heard Russo's voice. He kicked the door open, and what he saw made the blood in his veins turn to ice. Russo stood in the center of the room, one arm locked across Alara's chest, the other hand pressing a gun to her temple. Alara looked awful. her face swollen and bruised, dried blood at the corner of her mouth. But those green eyes were still bright when they found him, still full of life and the stubborn strength he loved in her. Russo laughed, the wild laugh of a man who knew he'd lost but still wanted to drag his enemy down into hell with him. He said Ronan could kill all his men, could destroy everything he'd built, but he would take this woman with him. He would make Ronan live in pain for the rest of his life, the way he'd lived since Ronan took back what belonged to the Kale family. Ronan raised his gun, but he had no clean shot. Russo was completely covered behind Alara, only a sliver of his face exposed, and if Ronan missed by even a centimeter, the bullet would go through Alara's head instead of Russo's. It was an impossible shot, one even the best marksman wouldn't dare risk. But then Alara looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his throat tighten. Trust, absolute and total. She said, her voice raw but steady, that she trusted him. Then she shifted slightly to the left, only a few centimeters, just enough to open a small gap between her shoulder and Russo's forehead. Ronan didn't hesitate. He couldn't. All the years of training, all the sleepless nights at the range, every promise he'd ever made to himself that no one he loved would be harmed, all of it collapsed into a single moment, a single breath, a single squeeze of the trigger. The bullet flew, punched through Alara's left shoulder, and drove straight into the center of Victor Russo's forehead. Russo fell like a puppet with its strings cut, and Alara went down with him because there was nothing holding her up anymore. Ronan ran to her and caught her before she hit the ground, pulled her into his arms, pressed his face into her hair, and for the first time since his father died, Ronan Kyle cried. He cried with relief, with fear, with love, with every feeling he'd locked away for years. Alara lifted a trembling hand and brushed his face, whispering that she'd told him she trusted him. She always trusted him. And Ronan kissed her in the stench of gunpowder and blood, kissed her as if it were his last breath, and he promised that from this moment on he would never let her endure anything like this again. Weeks had passed since that fateful night in the warehouse, and Alara spent most of her time stretched out on the large bed in the penthouse's primary bedroom, where the morning sun poured through the glass and lay over her like a warm blanket. The wound in her shoulder was slowly healing under the care of Dr. Thorne, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, skillful hands, and a deep, steady voice. The man, Ronan said, had cared for the Kale family for years and was one of the very few people he trusted without question. Doctor. Thorne came every day, changed the dressings, checked the injury, and always praised her, saying she was recovering with astonishing speed, that the life inside her was stronger than anyone he'd ever met. Ronan barely left her side. He worked right there in the bedroom with his laptop balanced on his thighs. He fed her when she was still too weak to hold a spoon. He read to her when she couldn't sleep through the pain, and every night he lay beside her, holding her with a gentleness that avoided the injury, as if he feared that if he loosened his arms, she would disappear. One afternoon, when Alara could finally sit up and move around the room on her own, Sienna came to visit. The young woman walked in with eyes swollen and red, as if she'd been crying the entire way. And when she saw Alara sitting by the window with white bandages wrapped around her shoulder, Sienna ran to her and threw her arms around her, sobbing like a child. Sienna said she was sorry she'd introduced Alara to her brother, sorry she'd pulled her into this dangerous world, sorry for everything Alara had endured. Alara held Sienna and told her she didn't regret a single thing, that if she could choose again, she would make the exact same decisions because she loved Ronan and she would do anything to protect the people he loved. Sienna lifted her head, tears still clinging to her cheeks, and she said Alara had saved their family, not only from Russo, but had saved her brother from the darkness he'd lived in for years. Alara had brought light back into Ronan's life, and that was more precious than anything in the world. They sat together for a long time, talking about everything and nothing, and Alara felt that Sienna was no longer just the sister of the man she loved. She had become her own sister. Days later, good news came. Mira went into labor in the early morning, and Ronan drove Alara to the hospital despite Doctor Thorne's protest that she needed rest. Alara said she'd missed too much in her sister's life already. She wasn't going to miss this moment even if she had to crawl to the hospital. They arrived just as Mira hit the worst of the contractions, and Alara held her sister's hand and told her she was stronger than she thought, that she could do this, that Alara would always be here. In the morning, a baby's cry rang out in the delivery room, and Mira held her tiny son against her chest with tears of happiness streaming down her face. She named him Harlan after Alara and Mira's father, the firefighter who had given his life to save others. Alara cried when she heard the name, cried from missing her father, cried from joy, cried because after so much pain and loss, her small family finally had a new member. Ronan stood in the corner the whole time, watching quietly, not wanting to intrude on the sacred moment between the two sisters. But when Mira looked up and asked if he wanted to hold his nephew, Alara saw something shift in his eyes. Ronan stepped forward, and when Mira placed baby Harlan into his arms, the most powerful man in Chicago suddenly looked like a boy holding the most precious thing in the world. He cradled the baby so carefully, so lightly, as if he feared one wrong movement could shatter that fragile new life. Baby Harlan wriggled against him, then opened his eyes and stared straight at Ronan's face, and Alara watched Ronan's cold, gray-blue eyes soften, melting the way ice melts in sunlight. He looked at the baby with a tenderness Alara had never seen in him. And when he lifted his gaze and met hers, she saw a dream in his eyes, a dream he'd never spoken aloud, a dream of a family, of children, of a normal life he'd always believed he didn't deserve. Alara stepped to him, rested her hand on his arm, and whispered that he would be a wonderful father. Ronan looked at her, and in that moment, in a hospital room washed in early morning light and filled with the cry of a newborn, Alara saw who the man she loved truly was. Not the cold mafia boss Chicago feared, not the ruthless killer who had fired through her shoulder to take down his enemy, but a man with a warm heart and a wounded soul. A man who had lost too much and still ached to be loved. A man she wanted to spend the rest of her life healing and being healed beside. After baby Harlan was born, Alara had nearly fully recovered. The injury in her shoulder reduced to a faint scar that Dr. Thorne said would fade with time. That night, Ronan took her up to the penthouse rooftop where there was a small garden he said his mother had planted years ago, back when she was still healthy, a place where white daisies still bloomed even without regular care. They sat on an old wooden bench with the lights of Chicago glittering below them, and Ronan was quiet for a long time before he finally began to speak. He said that for years, since the day his father died, he had lived with only one purpose: revenge and protecting his family. And he had done things he wasn't proud of, had become someone he sometimes didn't recognize in the mirror. And he had believed it was the only path, that there was no other choice for a man born into a family like his. But then she appeared, soaked and smeared with mud in the most luxurious restaurant in Chicago, and she changed everything. Alara tried to say something, but Ronan set a finger to her lips and went on. He said that when he watched her hold baby Harlan, when he watched her grip Mira's hand in the delivery room, when he watched her hug Sienna and call her sister, he realized he wanted more than survival. He wanted a life he could be proud of. He wanted to build something instead of only destroying. He wanted to use the power and money he had to do good instead of merely endure. He brought up that night in the penthouse when she'd told him her dream, the shelter for victims of domestic violence, the place women like Nadia needed to run to before it was too late. He said he hadn't forgotten his promise. And now that Russo was gone, now that every threat had been removed, it was time to keep it. "We're going to build that place, Alara," he said. his voice steady and full of resolve. Together. Alara looked at him, unable to find words, her heart beating so fast she could barely breathe. She asked if he was sure, because a project like that would cost an enormous amount of money and effort. And she didn't want him doing it only because of her. Ronan smiled and said he wasn't doing it only because of her. He was doing it because he wanted to become the kind of man worthy of her. He was doing it because he wanted baby Harlan to grow up knowing the Kale family wasn't made of darkness alone, that there was light in their name too. The rooftop door opened and Garrick stepped out. He stopped when he saw them together and he started to turn back, but Ronan called him over. Ronan told Garrick about the plan, about the center to support victims of domestic violence, about using the Kale family's resources to do something that mattered. Garrick stood in silence for a long moment, and Alara watched the older man's expression shift from surprise to thoughtfulness, and then into something that looked like pride. He nodded and said it was time the Kale family did something that would make Isolde proud. It was time they proved the name Kale could stand for something more than fear. Alara looked at the two men in front of her, the man she loved and the man who had taught her how to protect herself, and she felt tears spill over before she could stop them. She cried, not from sorrow or fear like before, but from happiness, because for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like an empty blur. It felt like a clear road lit with hope. Ronan pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, and he whispered in her ear that this was only the beginning, that they would build something beautiful from the ashes of the past, that her dream would become real, and he would be beside her every step of the way. Alara lifted her face, looked into those gray-blue eyes, and she knew she had found where she belonged. Months later, on a spring morning when cherry blossoms bloomed across Chicago, the Havens Refuge Center officially opened its doors to its first guests. The 3-story building on the south side had been renovated from an old, abandoned factory, and now it glowed with warm, cream-colored walls, large windows that welcomed sunlight, and a small front garden where white daisies swayed in the breeze. The name, Havens Refuge. The idea Alara chose was meant to be a harbor for women lost in the storms of their lives, a place they could come when there was nowhere else left to go. The center offered temporary housing for victims of domestic violence who needed to flee their abusers, free legal counseling to help them divorce and fight for custody, medical care for wounds both on the body and inside the spirit, and most of all, a community where they would know they weren't alone. Alara stood at the front doors on opening morning in a pale blue dress Ronan had picked for her, and she still couldn't believe that the dream she'd once thought would remain only a dream had become real. She was the director of Havens Refuge, a role she'd first refused because she believed she wasn't capable. But Ronan and Sienna had convinced her that no one understood these women better than she did. And no one could lead this place better than the woman who had once watched Nadia die in her arms. Guests began to arrive. Donors, city officials, reporters, and ordinary people curious to see what the infamous Kale family was doing with their money. But the moment that moved Alara most was when she saw Theo, the young boy she had pulled from a sinking car earlier, standing beside his mother with a sheet of paper in his hand and an expression so serious it was almost funny. Lydia, Theo's mother, had become one of Havens Refuge's first employees. She was in charge of greeting and supporting new arrivals because she said she understood what it felt like to be saved when everything seemed finished, and she wanted to give that back to someone else. When it was time for speeches, Theo was invited up to the small stage, set in front of the center's entrance. And the boy stood there with knees trembling, looking down at the paper in his hand and then up at the crowd. He said that months ago, he thought he was going to die. He thought he would never see his mother again, never go back to school, never play basketball again. But then a woman jumped into freezing water to save him. A woman he'd never met, never even known the name of. And that woman had given him a second chance to live. Theo looked at Alara, his eyes shining, and he said that, Miss Alara had taught him there were still good people in the world, people willing to sacrifice themselves for strangers, and he hoped that when he grew up, he would become someone like that. Ilara cried. She couldn't stop it, and she saw many people in the crowd wiping their own eyes. Sienna stood at the edge of the stage in her white doctor's coat. She would lead Havens Refuge's volunteer medical services, spending every weekend providing free care for women and children who needed help. She winked at Ilara when their eyes met, a small gesture that held an entire sisterhood they had built through so much hardship. But what surprised Ilara most was when she saw a wheelchair pushed into the front row, and in it sat Isolde Kyle, Ronan's mother. She'd been brought out of the nursing home for the first time in years to attend this ceremony. And when she saw her son on the stage preparing to speak, those gray-blue eyes that matched Ronan's lit with recognition, something Ilara understood was rare. Isolde recognized her son, not only recognized him, but understood what he was doing, and tears rolled down her lined cheeks, tears of pride from a mother watching her child become the man she had always hoped he would be. Ronan stepped onto the stage, and instead of talking about the center, the money invested, the services they would offer, he spoke about Ilara. He said that more than months ago he had met a woman who had shown up to a date drenched and smeared with blood, and that woman had changed his life forever. He said Ilara had taught him that true strength wasn't measured by how many people feared you, but by how many people you had helped. He said Havens Refuge wasn't only a charity center. It was the embodiment of Ilara's heart, of the kindness and courage she carried inside her, and he was prouder than anything in the world to stand beside her. When Ronan finished and stepped down, he went straight to his mother, knelt beside her wheelchair, and took her hand. Isolde lifted her trembling hand and touched her son's face, and she whispered the two words Ronan had waited his whole life to hear from his mother. "My son, I'm proud of you." After the grand opening ceremony ended and the last guests had gone home, Ronan took Ilara's hand and told her there was one more thing he wanted to show her. Door opened. Ilara forgot how to breathe. Door opened. Ilara forgot how to breathe at the sight in front of her. Hundreds of tiny lights were strung everywhere, casting a warm golden glow, like fallen stars brought down to earth. And all across the rooftop were white daisies, the same flowers her father used to bring home to her mother every week, the same flowers Ronan had left at her door after the night they met. Ilara turned to Ronan with eyes wide in shock and emotion, and she saw him looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. Worried and hopeful at the same time, like a boy waiting for the answer to the most important question of his life. Ronan guided her to the center of the rooftop where a circle had been formed out of white daisy petals, and he dropped to one knee. Ilara lifted a hand to cover her mouth, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Ronan pulled out a small black velvet box and opened it, and inside was a ring with a vivid green emerald surrounded by small, sparkling diamonds. He said he chose an emerald because it was the same color as her eyes, the eyes he'd looked into on the very first night they met, and known his life would never be the same again. He said she'd come into his life like a storm, drenched and smeared with grime, and she'd swept him out of the darkness he'd lived in for years. He said she'd taught him how to love, how to forgive himself, how to believe that even a man like him deserved happiness, and he asked if she would agree to spend the rest of her life beside him. Be his wife, be his family, be the home he'd always been searching for. Ilara cried, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her lips were breaking into the brightest smile she'd ever worn, and she said yes. She said yes 1,000 times. She said yes until her voice broke and all she could do was nod. Ronan rose, slid the ring onto her finger, and kissed her beneath the glittering lights and the sweet scent of white daisies. And Ilara knew this was the moment she would remember until the last day of her life. Months later, they held their wedding right at Haven's Refuge in the small front garden where the white daisies were still blooming. Beside the flowers and candles, two photographs were placed with careful honor, one of Alara's father in his firefighter uniform with a gentle smile, and one of Ronan's father in a black suit, with an expression that was stern but warm. The two fathers were no longer in this world, but they were still present on the most important day of their children's lives, still watching, still blessing the love their children had found. Garrick stood beside Ronan as best man, the middle-aged man with graying hair and sharp eyes, wearing a full suit for the first time instead of his usual black clothes. And Alara saw him discreetly wipe his eyes when Ronan spoke his vows. Sienna stood beside Alara as maid of honor, glowing in a pastel blue dress, and she held Alara's hand tight as if she were pouring every ounce of strength and love into the woman who was about to become her sister-in-law. Mira sat in the front row holding baby Harlan in her arms, the boy sleeping peacefully, unaware that his aunt was stepping into a new chapter of her life. Isolde was brought in her wheelchair, and today was one of the rare days when she was fully lucid. She recognized everyone, and she cried through the entire ceremony, tears of joy from a mother who was finally seeing her son find peace. Theo and Lydia were there too, and the boy was older and no longer afraid of water, and he carried the wedding rings to the altar with a seriousness that made it look like the most important mission of his life. When it was time to speak their vows, Ronan looked into Alara's eyes and said he swore to love her on bright, sunny days and on stormy ones, in happiness and in hardship. He swore he would be a safe harbor for her the way she had been a safe harbor for him, and he swore he would spend every remaining day of his life becoming worthy of the love she had given him. Alara said she swore to love him for everything he had been, everything he was, and everything he would become. She swore she would stand beside him through every storm the way she had stood beside him on the night they faced Russo, and she swore she would build with him a family overflowing with love, where their children would grow up knowing they were loved without conditions. When they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, everyone clapped and cheered, and Alara looked around at the faces she loved. Sienna crying and laughing at the same time, Garrick nodding with quiet satisfaction, Mira holding baby Harlan close, Isolde smiling with proud eyes, and Alara realized that family wasn't always the people who shared your blood. Sometimes family was the people life brought to you, the ones who chose to love you and were chosen by you in return. She thought about that stormy night earlier when she'd jumped into freezing water to save a boy she didn't know, when she'd appeared in the most luxurious restaurant in Chicago, looking half destroyed, when she'd believed her life was over and there was nothing left to hope for. She hadn't known that the storm that night would carry her to Ronan, to love, to a new family, to a dream she'd once believed would remain only a dream. And when Alara looked into her husband's gray-blue eyes, she whispered the line that would later be carved onto the sign outside Haven's Refuge. Sometimes a storm doesn't come to destroy you. Sometimes a storm comes to lead you home, to where you belong, to your own safe harbor. Alara and Ronan's story showed us that true love can come from the most unexpected places, that kindness and courage are always repaid, that a painful past doesn't define your future, and that even in the darkest moments there is always a light of hope waiting. If you've been moved by this story, if you believe in the power of love and compassion, please subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share this video so we can keep bringing meaningful stories every day. We'd truly love to know how you feel about Alara and Ronan's story. Whether you believe love can change a person, whether you've ever met someone who came into your life like a storm and changed everything, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every word from the bottom of our hearts. We wish everyone watching this video strong health and a life filled with joy and peace each day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.